when we think about product management, it's like we are like our job is to understand the why and to bring forth like better client experiences.
I'm curious, like when you're thinking about building out, the product management team, like I see it at like a high level, and definitely like correct me if I'm wrong too, because this is, just getting into all of this space for the first time, but I see it as like very much a bridge between like the engineering side and like the business side, in terms of like actually getting like the feedback from the clients, like what they want to see, and like translating that like back and forth. Like, is that right? And then like, how do you think about, I guess building out a team from there that can actually do that in this type of environment?
Yeah, so it's so like kind of high level, like product management, like when we think about product management, like it's like we are like our job is to understand the why and to bring forth like better client experiences. And when we think about like the like what ClearStreet is offering as a product, like helping to set the tone for what the roadmap is, how it aligns to the vision, strategy, etc. Like basically helping to get that consensus on what we need to work on, where are we allocating resources, what are we actually doing. So like the way that we envision us working with the other groups is really in tandem. So like, in some places like product will do the discovery and then hand it off to design, who then designs in some silo. And then whenever it's done, they hand it off to engineers. Like, no, we want this to be like a three legs of the tripod, like working on it together, because we think that there's value in having everybody on the same page from the beginning. Like if you can all share in those client insights early on, then there's a higher probability that you're going to build a product that suits what the clients are looking for, because you've all been working on it together from very beginning, early stages. So like that's kind of like just kind of product design engineers. And then the ClearStreet has this like unique thing of like, we're operating in a very like specific space where like knowledge is not just like, oh, what's like a ride sharing app situation. It's like you have to have knowledge about like the domain that we operate in. So like we think of it as like an additional pillar of an SME, a subject matter expert. So like how do you four folks work together to like again create a product or an experience that is good for the client, good for ClearStreet. So like the way that we think about like doing this is really in tandem with like all these groups that we mentioned. And when we think about like how business is involved, like there's going to be like stakeholders in what you're trying to deliver. So example would be like, if we're trying to deliver like a better tradeaway experience, like client operations is inherently like one of the stakeholders that we need to like be in touch with. So they're part of our discovery. We're going to interview them in the same way that we would interview an external client to understand what their needs are, what their wants are, what have they seen in the space, et cetera. They're probably they're less connected when it comes to actual like iteration designs, et cetera. They probably tend to see like more of the output of what we do, but like they're very much like involved in kind of like the initial like, the initial discovery, like they're going to be heavily involved in the actual like development. Like once we get to design, kind of drop off there, but then picks up again once we get to like a better state with design. And then same thing from development, like, drops off a little bit, or actually is probably high as we're affirming of requirements, drops off as the development's done. And then once we get to the end and there's testing, like that's when they're involved again. So like, it's a little bit like it ebbs and flows, but like, having that level of like connectedness with them is important because, ultimately if whether they need to support the product, when it's rolled out and clients are actually using it, or they just need to understand, what's happening and whether or not we're factoring in all of like the client needs, like they just need to be a part of that conversation. And so it's like finding business stakeholders or, people that are naturally collaborative in that way and, willing to think kind of outside the box of like, they can tell us what's happening today, but then they can also help us frame the conversation of like what needs to happen in the future. Like what is the true client pain point? Like why are they doing this? Like really get to the guts of that, the action of the workflow. Like that's really important to us. And then when we think about like, kind of scaling or, building the product team, like you don't necessarily need product managers with like deep domain expertise in like all areas. it really is specific to the area and kind of like what needs to be developed. Like in the execution space, like you actually do need deep domain knowledge because, you know, there's all sorts of very like nuanced things about execution that's important for a PM to know. But perhaps if you're thinking about like the client portal or, you know, a PM that would be working in that like regard, like maybe you don't need as much domain expertise. But that's really a function of like having that partnership with the designers, the developers, and the subject matter experts, because, you know, the ways in which an SME can kind of like supplement the knowledge of a PM could be incredibly useful if they're not coming from that domain. So that's kind of how I think generically we're thinking about like the product team.